Black CEO denied withdrawal, froze when she said I own this bank. The morning sun reflected off the glass doors of Metropolitan Trust Bank as Gabrielle Williams stepped through the entrance, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor with quiet confidence. She had dressed deliberately simple today, wearing a navy business suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, though you wouldn't know it from looking at it. Her natural hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and she carried a leather briefcase that held documents worth millions of dollars. But to anyone watching, she looked like just another professional woman coming to handle her banking needs on this busy Thursday morning. The title of this story, Black CEO Denied Withdrawal, froze when she said I own this bank, would soon become the most talked about incident in the financial world, but in this moment, Gabrielle was just another customer walking into a bank that she secretly controlled through her investment company, wondering if the reports she had been receiving about discrimination at various branches were actually true. The bank lobby was impressive with its high ceilings and crystal chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds in the morning light. Customers moved through the space with purpose, some heading to the ATM machines, others waiting in cushioned chairs for their appointments with loan officers. Gabrielle noticed how the bank tellers smiled warmly at the white customers, engaging in friendly conversation about the weather or weekend plans, while barely making eye contact with a few black and Hispanic customers in line. She had been monitoring this particular branch for months through customer complaint data, and the statistics were troubling. Minority customers waited an average of 15 minutes longer than white customers, were asked for additional identification 70% more often, and were denied services at 3 times the rate despite having similar financial profiles. But numbers on a spreadsheet were different from experiencing it firsthand, which is why Gabrielle had decided to visit the bank personally, without revealing her identity, as the CEO of Apex Financial Holdings, the company that owned 42% of Metropolitan Trust Bank's shares. Marcus Chen stood behind the teller window number 3, his fingers drumming impatiently on the counter as he watched Gabrielle approach. He had been working at the bank for 8 years, and considered himself good at reading people, especially the ones who didn't belong in a place like Metropolitan Trust. His eyes swept over Gabrielle with the kind of assessment that made her skin crawl, though she kept her expression neutral and professional. To Marcus, she was just another person trying to access money she probably didn't have, wearing clothes she couldn't afford, playing a role that didn't fit. He had already decided she would be trouble before she even reached his window, and his body language showed it clearly. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and put on the expression he reserved for customers he considered suspicious, which somehow always seemed to be the ones with darker skin. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he would rather do anything else than assist her with whatever she needed. Gabrielle placed her withdrawal slip on the counter with practiced calm, having filled it out carefully before approaching the window. She needed to withdraw $30,000 from her personal account for a charity auction she was attending that evening, where she planned to bid on several items to support a youth education program in underserved communities. It was a routine transaction for her, something she had done dozens of times at other banks without any issues. But Marcus looked at the withdrawal slip like she had just handed him a forged document, his eyebrows shooting up in exaggerated surprise. $30,000, he said loudly enough for other customers to hear, his voice dripping with skepticism that made several heads turn in their direction. "That's a very large amount of money. I'm going to need to see multiple forms of identification, proof of employment, and documentation showing the source of these funds." He pushed the withdrawal slip back toward her like it was contaminated, adding with a smirk, "We have to be very careful about fraud these days, you understand." The woman standing in line behind Gabrielle, a young white woman in yoga pants and a designer handbag, had just withdrawn $25,000 from Marcus's colleague at the next window with nothing more than her driver's license and a smile. The contrast was so obvious that even other customers began to notice the different treatment Gabrielle was receiving. An elderly black man in the waiting area shook his head sadly, having seen this scene play out too many times before. A Hispanic mother with 2 children clutched her deposit envelope tighter, wondering if she would face the same treatment when her turn came. But what really caught Gabrielle's attention was the young woman with purple streaks in her hair who had quietly taken out her phone and started recording the interaction, sensing that something important was about to unfold. This was exactly the kind of evidence Gabrielle had been hoping to gather, though experiencing the discrimination firsthand made her stomach turn with a mixture of anger and determination. "I have my driver's license and my bank card right here," Gabrielle said calmly, producing both from her wallet and placing them on the counter with deliberate precision. The bank card was a Platinum Premier Access card, the kind reserved for customers with account balances over $1 million, but Marcus barely glanced at it before pushing it back toward her. "These could be fake," he announced, loud enough for the growing audience to hear clearly. "We see very sophisticated forgeries all the time, especially with people trying to make large withdrawals they are not entitled to. I'm going to need to call my supervisor to verify this supposed account of yours." The way he emphasized the word supposed made it clear he had already decided she was lying, that someone like her couldn't possibly have that much money in an account at Metropolitan Trust Bank. What Marcus didn't know was that Gabrielle had 12 different accounts at the bank totaling over $8 million, not counting the billions her investment company controlled through their majority stake in the bank's parent corporation. Rebecca Morrison, the branch supervisor, approached with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had been watching the interaction and had already chosen her side. She was a woman in her 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair, and a string of pearls that she touched nervously when dealing with customers she considered problematic. Rebecca had been promoted to supervisor 3 years ago despite numerous complaints about her treatment of minority customers, complaints that had been mysteriously dismissed or lost in the bureaucratic system. She looked at Gabrielle with the same suspicious expression Marcus had worn, then turned to him with a knowing nod that said she understood the situation completely without needing any explanation. "What seems to be the problem here?" Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she had already decided Gabrielle was the problem, not the discrimination she was facing. "This customer is trying to withdraw $30,000, Marcus explained, his voice carrying a tone of accusation rather than simple information. "She claims to have an account here, but I have serious doubts about the authenticity of her documentation. The identification could be counterfeit, and we have no verification of her employment or source of funds. I think we need to follow our security protocols very carefully here." The security protocols he referenced were supposed to apply equally to all customers requesting large withdrawals, but somehow they only seemed to be enforced when certain types of customers made such requests. Rebecca nodded approvingly at Marcus's vigilance, then turned to Gabrielle with a condescending smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you can understand that we have to protect our customers' assets from fraudulent activity. A withdrawal of this size requires extensive verification, especially when we're not familiar with the account holder." The irony of Rebecca's statement wasn't lost on Gabrielle, who had been banking at this branch for over 2 years, though she had deliberately kept a low profile to observe operations without interference. She had watched Rebecca greet other customers by name, customers who happened to be white and wealthy-looking, authorizing their large transactions, with nothing more than a friendly chat about their vacation plans or their children's college choices. But here stood Rebecca, pretending that Gabrielle was a complete stranger, a suspicious character who needed to be investigated before being allowed to access her own money. The young woman with the purple hair had moved closer, her phone capturing every word, every expression, every moment of this unfolding discrimination. She would later post the video online with the caption "Banking while Black in 2024", not knowing that she was documenting one of the most significant moments in banking history. "I would like to complete my withdrawal, Please, Gabrielle said firmly, maintaining her composure despite the anger building inside her chest like a storm gathering strength. My identification is valid, my account is real, and I have every right to access my funds without being subjected to additional scrutiny based on assumptions about my race or economic status. The directness of her words made Rebecca step back slightly, her hand going to her pearl necklace in a gesture of offended surprise. Marcus's face flushed red with indignation that this woman would dare to suggest discrimination was taking place, even though everyone watching could see it clearly. Are you accusing us of racism? Rebecca asked, her voice rising to a pitch that drew even more attention from customers and bank employees alike. Because I assure you, Metropolitan Trust Bank treats all customers equally. We simply have policies in place to prevent fraud, and those policies apply to everyone. The lie was so bold, so obvious, that several customers actually laughed out loud. The elderly black man in the waiting area stood up and walked closer, his voice strong despite his age, as he said, I've been banking here for 20 years, and I've never seen you ask a white customer for employment verification to make a withdrawal from their own account. A young Asian woman in a business suit added her voice to the growing chorus of witnesses, she's right. I watch you wave through withdrawal requests all the time without any of this extra scrutiny, but only for certain customers. The momentum was building, the truth becoming impossible to ignore, but Rebecca and Marcus held their ground, with the stubborn determination of people who had never been held accountable for their actions. If you continue to cause a disturbance, I'll have to ask security to escort you out, Rebecca threatened, reaching for the phone on Marcus's desk, as if to call for backup. This was her usual tactic when minority customers challenged the discriminatory treatment they received, using the threat of force to silence legitimate complaints. But Gabrielle didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't show any of the fear that Rebecca expected to see. Instead, she opened her briefcase with slow, deliberate movements that commanded attention from everyone in the growing crowd. Before you call security, Gabrielle said, her voice carrying a new note of authority that made Rebecca's hand freeze above the phone. There's something you should know about who you're threatening to have removed from this bank. The documents Gabrielle pulled from her briefcase were bound in expensive leather, embossed with gold lettering that caught the light as she placed them on the counter. The first document was a single page that she laid directly in front of Marcus, whose face went pale as he read the heading, Certificate of Ownership, Apex Financial Holdings, Majority Shareholder Metropolitan Trust Bank Corporation. The second document was a board resolution dated 3 months earlier, appointing Gabrielle Williams as Chief Executive Officer of Apex Financial Holdings, with full authority over all subsidiary operations. The third was a printout of the bank's own shareholder registry, showing that Apex Financial Holdings owned 42% of all outstanding shares, making them the controlling interest in the bank's parent company. Marcus's hands began to shake as the implications of what he was reading sank in like a stone dropping into deep water. My name is Gabrielle Williams, she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her authority as she addressed not just Marcus and Rebecca, but the entire crowd that had gathered to witness this moment. I am the CEO of Apex Financial Holdings, and through our majority stake in Metropolitan Trust Bank Corporation, I effectively own this bank. I've been monitoring discriminatory practices at this branch for the past 6 months, documenting every incident, every complaint, every time a customer was treated differently because of the color of their skin. Today, I came here as a regular customer to see for myself if the reports were true, and you've given me all the evidence I need. The silence that followed her revelation was absolute, broken only by the sound of Rebecca's pearl necklace hitting the floor as her trembling fingers lost their grip. Rebecca's face had turned the color of ash, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound, as her brain struggled to process the catastrophic mistake she had just made. Marcus had actually stepped back from his window, his body hitting his chair so hard it rolled backward and crashed into the wall behind him. The other bank employees had frozen in place like statues, their normal routines completely forgotten as they watched their supervisor and colleague face the consequences of their discrimination. The customers who had been recording everything on their phones were typing furiously, posting updates to social media that would soon go viral around the world. Black CEO denied withdrawal, froze when she said I own this bank, would become the headline that destroyed careers and changed banking policies nationwide, but in this moment, it was simply the truth hanging in the air like lightning about to strike. Mrs. Williams Rebecca finally managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper, as she attempted to salvage something from the wreckage of her career. I had no idea. If we had known who you were. But Gabrielle cut her off with a raised hand, her expression showing exactly how little patience she had for excuses. That's exactly the problem, Mrs. Morrison. You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect and follow proper banking procedures. Every customer who walks through those doors deserves the same professional service, regardless of their race, their appearance, or your assumptions about their economic status. The fact that you're only apologizing now, after learning about my position, proves that the discrimination was intentional. The young woman with purple hair stepped forward, her phone still recording as she addressed Gabrielle directly. Mrs. Williams, I'm Jordan Martinez, I'm a journalism student at the university, and I've been documenting discrimination at this branch for my thesis project. I have dozens of videos showing similar treatment of minority customers over the past 3 months. Would you be interested in seeing them? Gabrielle nodded, recognizing an opportunity to gather even more evidence for the complete restructuring she was about to implement. Other customers began sharing their own stories, creating an impromptu testimony session that revealed years of systematic discrimination that had been ignored or covered up by bank management. Mr. Chen, Gabrielle said, turning her attention back to Marcus, who looked like he might faint at any moment. Your employment with Metropolitan Trust Bank is terminated immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, and your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file. You are prohibited from seeking employment at any financial institution owned or affiliated with Apex Financial Holdings, which includes 47 banks across the country. Marcus tried to protest, tried to claim he was just following policy, but the words died in his throat when he saw the expression on Gabrielle's face. She had the look of someone who had heard every excuse, every justification for discrimination, and had no patience left for any of them. Mrs. Morrison, Gabrielle continued, turning to Rebecca, who was now crying silently, her carefully constructed professional image crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. You will also be terminated immediately, but because you were in a supervisory position and allowed this discrimination to flourish under your watch, you will also face a formal investigation by the Federal Banking Commission. Every complaint that was filed during your tenure will be reviewed, and if we find evidence that you deliberately suppressed or ignored reports of discrimination, you will face federal charges for violating the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Rebecca's tears turned to sobs as she realized that she wasn't just losing her job, she was potentially facing criminal prosecution for her role in systematic discrimination. The crowd in the bank had grown larger as word spread through social media that something extraordinary was happening at Metropolitan Trust Bank. News vans were already pulling up outside, reporters rushing in with cameras and microphones to capture what was quickly becoming a national story. Gabrielle stood in the center of it all, calm and composed, using this moment not for personal vindication but as a platform for institutional change. She turned to address the cameras that were now focused on her, knowing that her words would be heard by millions of people who had experienced similar discrimination at banks across the country. What happened here today is not an isolated incident, Gabrielle said, her voice clear and strong as she spoke to the cameras and the growing crowd. This is a systematic problem that affects millions of Americans who are denied equal access to financial services because of the color of their skin. Banks have paid billions in fines for discriminatory practices, but those fines haven't changed the culture that allows discrimination to flourish. Today, that changes. Apex Financial Holdings is implementing a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination at all of our affiliated banks. Any employee found treating customers differently based on race, ethnicity, or any other protected characteristic will be terminated immediately. We're also establishing a customer advocacy department that will investigate all complaints of discrimination and report directly to me. The elderly black man who had spoken up earlier approached Gabrielle with tears in his eyes, extending his hand for her to shake. "Thank you," he said simply, but those two words carried the weight of decades of enduring similar treatment, of being made to feel less than human in places where his money should have been as good as anyone else's. The Hispanic mother with her children came forward too, sharing her story of being denied a small business loan despite having excellent credit, while watching white applicants with worse financial profiles receive approval. Jordan Martinez was interviewing other customers, gathering their stories for what would become an award-winning documentary about banking discrimination and the day everything changed. "I want to address the employees of this branch who were not involved in today's incident," Gabrielle continued, making sure to acknowledge the tellers and staff members who had watched in horror as their colleagues discriminated against her. "I know that many of you have wanted to speak up about the discrimination you've witnessed but were afraid of retaliation. That fear ends today. We're establishing an anonymous reporting system where employees can report discrimination without fear of losing their jobs. In fact, employees who report discrimination will be eligible for bonuses and promotions, because standing up for what's right should be rewarded, not punished." A young black teller named Anthony stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion, as he said, "Mrs. Williams, I've worked here for 3 years, and I've watched Marcus and Rebecca treat our customers like criminals just for being black or brown. I've filed 2 complaints with HR, but nothing ever happened. They told me I was being too sensitive, that I was misunderstanding bank policy. Thank you for finally making them accountable." His courage inspired other employees to speak up, sharing their own experiences of witnessing discrimination and being powerless to stop it. The picture that emerged was of a toxic culture that had been allowed to fester because no one with real power had ever experienced it firsthand. Within an hour of Gabrielle's revelation, the stock price of Metropolitan Trust Bank Corporation had dropped by 12% as investors realized the scope of the potential lawsuits and regulatory actions the bank would face. But Gabrielle wasn't concerned about short-term stock fluctuations. She was focused on long-term change that would transform not just Metropolitan Trust Bank, but the entire banking industry. She announced that Apex Financial Holdings would be conducting surprise audits at all of their affiliated banks, using undercover customers to test whether minority customers received equal treatment. Any branch found to be discriminating would face immediate intervention, with managers being replaced and staff retrained or terminated. "I also want to announce a new initiative," Gabrielle said, pulling out another document from her briefcase. Apex Financial Holdings is establishing a $100 million fund to provide low-interest loans to minority-owned businesses that have been historically denied access to capital. We're also creating a financial literacy program that will offer free classes in underserved communities, teaching people how to build credit, save for the future, and invest in their dreams. For too long, banks have extracted wealth from communities of color without investing back in them. That ends today. The announcement was met with applause from the crowd, but Gabrielle wasn't finished. She had one more piece of business to conduct, the original reason she had come to the bank in the first place. She turned back to the teller windows, where the remaining employees stood frozen, unsure of what to do. "I still need to make my withdrawal," she said with a slight smile, the first one she had shown since entering the bank. $30,000 from my personal account, please. And I expect to be treated like any other valued customer of this bank." Anthony immediately stepped forward, his hands steady now as he said, "It would be my honor to assist you, Mrs. Williams." He processed her withdrawal with professional efficiency, counting out the money carefully and placing it in a bank envelope, with the respect that every customer deserved. The transaction that should have taken 5 minutes had turned into a 2-hour revelation that would change banking history, but Gabrielle had achieved something far more valuable than completing a simple withdrawal. She had exposed the truth, demanded accountability, and created real change that would benefit millions of people who had suffered in silence for too long. As Gabrielle prepared to leave the bank, the crowd parted to create a path for her, many people applauding, some crying, all understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Jordan Martinez asked for a final statement for her documentary, and Gabrielle turned to the camera one last time. To everyone who has ever been made to feel unwelcome in a bank, who has been treated with suspicion instead of respect, who has been denied services because of who you are rather than your financial qualifications, I want you to know that your experiences matter. Document everything. Report discrimination. And never accept being treated as less than equal. Banks exist to serve communities, all communities, and it's time they remembered that. The impact of that day rippled out far beyond Metropolitan Trust Bank. Within a week, 3 major banks announced new anti-discrimination policies and training programs. The Federal Banking Commission launched an industry-wide investigation into discriminatory practices, using Gabrielle's evidence as a starting point. Marcus Chen was unable to find employment in banking and eventually had to take a job in retail, where he learned what it felt like to be judged and dismissed by customers who thought they were better than him. Rebecca Morrison was charged with federal violations of banking law and eventually pled guilty to suppressing discrimination complaints, receiving 2 years of probation and a lifetime ban from working in financial services. But the most important changes were the ones that happened quietly, in banks across the country where employees who had witnessed discrimination finally felt empowered to speak up. Where managers who had turned a blind eye to bias realized they could no longer ignore it. Where customers who had been mistreated for years finally received the respect they deserved. The video of Gabrielle's confrontation with Marcus and Rebecca went viral, viewed over 50 million times, and becoming a teaching tool in business schools and diversity training programs. Black CEO denied withdrawal, froze when she said I own this bank, became more than just a headline, it became a rallying cry for economic justice and institutional change. 6 months after the incident, Gabrielle returned to the same branch of Metropolitan Trust Bank, this time not as an undercover customer but as the CEO conducting a public review of the changes that had been implemented. The branch had been completely transformed, with new management, retrained staff, and a customer service approach that treated everyone with equal respect and professionalism. Anthony had been promoted to branch manager, becoming the youngest person and the first black man to hold that position in the bank's history. Jordan Martinez's documentary had won several awards and helped launch her career as an investigative journalist focused on economic justice. Standing in the same spot where she had been discriminated against, Gabrielle addressed the gathering of employees, customers, and media who had come to witness the transformation. 6 months ago, this branch was a symbol of everything wrong with banking in America, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had changed an industry through sheer force of will and strategic action. Today, it stands as proof that change is possible when we have the courage to confront discrimination directly and the power to demand accountability. But our work is not done. This is just the beginning of a transformation that must reach every bank, every financial institution, every place where people's dreams and economic futures are determined. The journey from that morning, when Gabrielle walked into Metropolitan Trust Bank as an anonymous customer, to this moment of triumph, had been captured in thousands of videos, articles, and testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by her courage. But for Gabrielle, the real victory wasn't in the public vindication or the corporate accountability. It was in knowing that the next black woman who walked into this bank to withdraw her own money would be treated with the same respect and professionalism as anyone else. That was worth more than all the settlements, fines, and public apologies combined. As the event concluded and people began to disperse, the elderly black man who had witnessed the original incident approached Gabrielle one more time. "My granddaughter wants to be a banker," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For the first time in my life, I can tell her that's a good dream to have, that she'll be welcomed and valued in that profession. You didn't just change a bank, Mrs. Williams. You changed the future for kids like her." Gabrielle hugged the old man, feeling the weight and reward of the battle she had fought. The title of her story: Black CEO Denied Withdrawal, Froze When She Said I Own This Bank, would be remembered not as a moment of personal triumph, but as the day the banking industry was forced to reckon with its history of discrimination and begin the hard work of creating a more equitable future. The sun was setting over the city as Gabrielle left the bank for the final time, her work there complete but her mission far from over. Apex Financial Holdings had acquired 3 more banks in the months since the incident, each one undergoing the same transformation to eliminate discrimination and promote equality. The $100 million fund for minority businesses had already distributed $40 million in loans, creating over 3,000 jobs in communities that had been starved of investment for generations. The financial literacy program had graduated its first class of 500 students, many of whom were now opening their first bank accounts, starting their first businesses, or buying their first homes. But perhaps the most lasting impact of that day was the change in consciousness it created across America. People who had accepted discrimination as an unchangeable part of life realized they had power to demand better treatment. Employees who had witnessed injustice found the courage to speak up. And institutions that had profited from inequality understood that the cost of discrimination had become too high to bear. The video of Gabrielle saying "I own this bank" became a metaphor for economic empowerment, inspiring a generation of entrepreneurs and activists to acquire not just wealth, but the power to change systems from within. Years later, when business historians wrote about the transformation of American banking in the early 21st century, they would mark that morning at Metropolitan Trust Bank as a turning point. The moment when discrimination was exposed not by protesters outside the building, but by the owner inside it. When accountability came not from government regulations, but from market forces wielded by someone who understood that economic power could be a tool for social justice. When a black woman walked into a bank expecting to be treated like any other customer, and instead changed an entire industry by revealing that she owned it. The story of Black CEO Denied Withdrawal, Froze When She Said I Own This Bank, became required reading in business schools, a case study in corporate governance, discrimination law, and the power of strategic action. But for the millions of people who had experienced similar discrimination, it was something more personal. It was validation that their experiences mattered, proof that justice was possible, and inspiration to never accept being treated as less than equal. Gabrielle Williams had walked into that bank seeking to make a simple withdrawal, but she withdrew something far more valuable, the veil of acceptability that had hidden discrimination for far too long, leaving behind a banking system that could never go back to its old ways of doing business.